tablers are from the Socialists, Mr. Cerny Escalé; from the EPP, Mr. Joseph O'Reilly; from the European Conservatives, Mr. Oleksiy Goncharenko; from ALDE, Mr. Alexander Ryle; from United European Left, Mr. Paul Gavan. I remind them that they should go to the lobby of the Committee of Ministers when the ballot closes. For these first ballots, an absolute majority of the votes is required. I expect to announce the result of the election here in the Assembly Chamber before the end of this morning's sitting. If a second round is needed, this will take place this afternoon between 4:30 p.m. and 6:30 p.m. I now declare the ballot open. We now come to the joint debate on a report from the Committee on Legal Affairs and Human Rights titled Legal and Human Rights Aspects of the Russian Federation's Aggression Against Ukraine, document 15998, presented by Mr. Davor Ivo-Stier. A report from the Committee on Political Affairs and Democracy titled The Role of Sanctions in Countering the Russian Federation's War of Aggression Against Ukraine, document 16000, presented by Mrs. Yelizaveta Yasko, and a report from the Committee on Culture, Science, Education and Media titled Countering the Erasure of Cultural Identity in War and Peace, document 16003, presented by Mrs. Yevgenia Kravchuk. These will be followed by a statement by Mr. Mikhail O'Flaherty, Commissioner for Human Rights of the Council of Europe. The debate must conclude by 1 p.m. and will continue this afternoon at 4:30, when we will hear the replies to the debate and consider the amendments tabled. I now call Mr. Stier, Rapporteur, to present the first report. Dear Davor, as you know, you have 7 minutes now and 3 minutes at the end to reply to the debate. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Mr. Commissioner, dear colleagues. This report is a follow-up report to Mr. Damian Scotier's last year report on the same topic, which led to the Assembly's Resolution 2482. Tragically, the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine continues to cause everyday death and destruction, as shown by the intensifying attacks on Kharkiv and eastern Ukraine. According to President Zelensky, since the beginning of this June alone, Russia has used more than 2,400 guided aerial bombs against Ukraine. Of these, around 700 have been targeted at the Kharkiv region. Over the last weekend, Russian forces struck Kharkiv twice. At least 4 people were killed and more than 60 injured. Many things have happened since Mr. Cotier's report adopted in January 2023. My report compiles all these developments, focusing on the actions that the Council of Europe and other actors have taken to ensure accountability for the Russian aggression. The Reykjavik summit and the setting up of the Register of Damage for Ukraine, which is now operational and has started to receive claims. The consultations with the core group of states supporting the creation of a special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine, in line with the Assembly's early calls to create such a tribunal already in April 2022, and the recent calls by our Assembly to use and repurpose the frozen Russian state assets for compensation of the damage caused to Ukraine. The report also refers to numerous reports documenting the war crimes, the crimes against humanity, and possible genocide that have been and are being committed by Russia in Ukraine. There is also a specific chapter on the role of the Wagner Group, which includes the latest developments since last year's failed mutiny and the death of Mr. Prigozhin. According to experts, Wagner's operations in Ukraine have now been subsumed by other Russian state and paramilitary units, including the Rosgvardia or the National Guard. The draft resolution deals with 3 main topics. First, the Special Tribunal for the crime of aggression. Second, other international crimes committed by Russia in the context of the aggression, including by the Wagner Group. And third, the compensation for the damage caused to Ukraine by the Russian aggression. As regards the Special Tribunal on the crime of aggression. The draft resolution considers that the proposal that is being discussed within the core group for establishing the tribunal through an agreement between the Council of Europe and Ukraine is at this stage the best feasible option in terms of its legal basis and political legitimacy. The creation of the tribunal would clearly fall within the mandate of the Council of Europe, as reflected in its statute and in accordance with the priorities set out in Reykjavik. The resolution therefore calls on the core group to come to an agreement as soon as possible and on all member and observer states to support this option and participate in the final agreement, including in the enlarged partial agreement that would support the tribunal. The draft resolution includes some of the features that the tribunal should have in view of the Assembly, and I hope that the core group and the Committee of Ministers will take this into account when drafting the agreement and the statute of the tribunal. This concerns, among others, the definition of the crime of aggression, its temporal jurisdiction, or the issue of personal immunities. Mr. Chair, let me also mention that the core group is meeting later this week in Bucharest and will examine some of these issues. Our resolution today, hopefully adopted unanimously or by a very large majority, will send a strong signal of support to this process and express very clearly the expectations and demands that the Assembly has vis-à-vis our capitals. With regard to the other international crimes committed in the context of aggression, the draft resolution welcomes the arrest warrants issued by the ICC and asks all states to enforce them and to continue supporting investigations by the ICC prosecutor and the Ukrainian authorities. It also invites the ICC prosecutor to examine possible allegations of genocide, not only in relation to the transfer of children, but more generally regarding the situation in Ukraine. And in this regard, this resolution takes a step further compared to our previous report and states that there is a growing body of evidence that the Russian Federation is attempting to commit genocide against the Ukrainian nation. This is also in line with the conclusions of the report prepared by Ms. Kravchuk for the Cultural Committee. When it comes to the compensation issue, and in line with the resolution adopted by the Assembly last April called support for the reconstruction of Ukraine, the draft supports the confiscation and repurposing of Russian state assets for the compensation of the damage to Ukraine and urges states to adopt legislative measures in this direction, following the recent example of the United States. It then calls again on states to establish an international compensation mechanism, which should include an international claims commission and an international compensation fund to which the confiscated assets should be transferred. In relation to the use of frozen Russian sovereign assets, I welcome the recent political agreement by the G7 to provide $50 billion of loans for Ukraine. It's mostly for weapons and other urgent needs, and using the interest from these assets. Now, this should be seen as a measure which can complement, not substitute, our own proposal to use the frozen assets as such for the purposes of compensation. Finally, a draft recommendation is also presented on the basis of the resolution calling on the Committee of Ministers to continue supporting Ukraine and working towards a full accountability, particularly through the setting up of the Special Tribunal and the conclusion of a bilateral agreement with Ukraine for this purpose. This brutal and illegal war of aggression must end, but peace must be based on justice for its victims. The Council of Europe has undertaken key action and initiatives for accountability, and our Assembly has often been at the forefront of these ideas. But it's time to see concrete results. The perpetrators of these crimes, and first of all, the Russian state leaders responsible for waging this war, including Mr. Putin, must realize that their crimes will not go unpunished and that justice and international law will prevail. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stier. I now call Mrs. Yasko, rapporteur to the second report. You have 7 minutes now and 3 minutes at the end to reply to the debate. Dear Elizaveta, you have the floor.
Dear colleagues, let me start by congratulating my co-reporters here and other, but very important similar topics that we're discussing this in one debate. Different components of the crimes, legal consequences, what can we do to protect, to counter aggression, and to look deeply on the cultural identity level, what the Russian aggression creates. The report of the role of sanctions in countering the Russian Federation war of aggression against Ukraine is covering many important, crucial issues. For more than 2 years that have passed, we have thousands and thousands of crimes that Russia committed, starting from deportation of Ukrainian children, starting from illegally capturing civilians, dozens, hundreds, thousands of crimes in environmental damage, destroying our flora and fauna, destroying our infrastructure, energy, destroying our lives, destroying our industries, destroying our ability to live in freedom, with the ability to hear the birds can be singing, because very often just all these attacks, they absolutely delete your ability to live and to breathe. For us, this is absolutely a survival mode. And when we hear the question, do sanctions work? Maybe we don't need sanctions. For us, it's very painful to hear, because sanctions is one of the tools that we actually have and is being imposed in a number of the sanction packages. Yes, there are loopholes, there are problems with sanctions, but still sanctions is the only one tool that is very effective in countering Russian aggression immediately. And in the first year of aggression, because of the sanctions, we managed to restrict Russian economy to run war against Ukraine, which means to commit less crimes. Yes, there are still thousands and millions of crimes, but still. And in this report, we cover a lot of important measures, such as, for instance, freezing of the Russian state assets, imposing of individual targeted sanctions, as well as introduction of an oil price cap and export control measures. Through these sanctions, we are capable to directly impact Russian access to foreign currencies, to reduce the revenues that Russia gains from exporting its oil, and to impede that Russians can put their hands on critical materials, machineries, dual-use goods, and the battlefield goods that they need to produce their deadly weapons used against Ukraine. The number and the range of sanctions being imposed against Russia are unprecedented, making it right now the most sanctioned country around the world. However, according to the study published this year by the group Yermak and Magfol, International Working Group on Sanctions, and the Kyiv School of Economics Institute, we have the data that during the first 10 months of 2023, Russian imports from the Western countries of critical items for its military industry reached over 22 billion worth. Almost 2,800 foreign components have been found in the Russian weapons, which means that 95 of which are being produced by as many as 250 Western companies. And we cannot be certain of this number. We believe that the number is much higher. In addition, Russia has managed to set up a shadow fleet composed of 300 to 600 old tankers sailing under different flags, which allows them to trade its oil international markets at the prices above the imposed cap. But there is a number of environmental terrible damages that these old tankers are imposing to all of us. And the report is covering an importance of consideration of possibly closing or creating restrictive measures for those ports who still are open for this shadow fleet. We need to make sure that Russia is not able to use this shadow fleet. Currently, there is also a number of loopholes and gaps that Russia is using through different channels. And one of the measures that we have to take collectively is making sure that the customs data banking is strengthened. We need to make sure that financial restrictions are tightened, that particular banning all Russian and Belarusian banks from accessing the SWIFT international payment messaging system, and enlarging the list of sanctioned individuals to include those responsible for the persecution of political prisoners that Russia is trying to kill. The resolution has a call to the Council of Europe member states and non-member states to join the coalition of the countries that are imposing restrictive measures, and also to make sure that we have an effective coordination tools to share the information, to make sure that implementation of sanctions is happening, to make sure that the weapons production complex inside Russia is also sanctioned, that those who are absolutely directly committed to commit war crimes are responsible. It also concerns the private sector. No matter how many state measures we impose, we also need to call to the corporate responsibility of different companies, because no Russia clause is not just a word. It should be the ethical code that no one should break, and there should be criminal responsibility for those who break it. Our report is currently also having a number of amendments that we're going to discuss this afternoon, and I'm calling this assembly to support a number of important amendments. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Yasko. I now call Madame Kravchuk, Rapporteur, to present the third report. As you know, you have 7 minutes now and 3 minutes at the end to reply to the debate.
Yes. Thank you, Chair, dear President, dear colleagues. Thank you, rapporteurs, and thank you for organizing this joint debate. It's very important for Ukraine. Probably I would talk for hours, not 7 minutes, about the contents of my report. But I decided to take with me a little bit to explain how Russia is destroying our identity. This is a book from Kharkiv, from publisher house Vivat and the publishing house Factor Drug. They were attacked in May this year. And I quote a witness: "Books were burning together with people who printed them. 7 people dead, 50,000 books burned." Of course, it's just a tiny example. And if we talk about culture, identity, cultural rights, the right of access to culture and enjoyment of one's own cultural heritage forms part of international human rights law. And Russian Federation is using cultural cleansing as a weapon of war to deny the existence of Ukrainian culture, identity, to erase Ukrainian historical roots, values, heritage, literature, language, and traditions. In Ukraine, we say that we experience a new executed renaissance of the 21st century. I'll explain how it works. Russians kill a writer, destroy a book of this writer, and then tell, "You never had a literature. Take our literature and use as its own." And it's not about just killing, hundreds of civilians, destroying civilian critical infrastructure. It's not just about the kidnapping children, trying to steal our future. It's about stealing our past. It's about ruining those things which define us as Ukrainians, cutting roots from the tree. Over 1,000 of cultural heritage objects were destroyed or damaged by Russian Federation. At the same time, since 2014, up to 2 million of museum objects were appropriated, were looted from Ukrainian museums and put into Russian museum collection. It's 1/5 of the remaining objects that we do still have in Ukrainian museums. The historic centers of Odessa and Lviv, due to the shelling and recent destructions, were placed into UNESCO in danger list in September 23. Mariupol is our pain. The world-famous drama theater and Kuinji Art Museum had been completely destroyed, and paintings of Kuinji and Ayvazovsky were looted. Hundreds of museums and works of art in Kyiv, Chernihiv, Kharkiv, Kherson regions had been destroyed. Illegal excavations in the occupied Crimea since 2014 were carried out by employees by the Russian Academy of Science Institute of Archaeology and the Hermitage Museum. Khersonis, Bakhchisarai Palace, the ancient Greek burial mound, and many other unique sites will never be seen in their recognized form. Russia has not abandoned its imperial habits presenting the monuments found in Ukraine as Russian, particularly to foreign audience. They also use this argument for historical rights to Ukrainian territories. And at the same time, they are demolishing the remembrance sites of Holodomor, and destroying and taking out the archives. The Hermitage and the Tretyakov Gallery keep and exhibit thousands of stolen works of art from Ukraine as their own, native Russian. Russian attacks also destroyed many libraries, and work to destroy everything Ukrainian is deliberately carried out on the occupied territories. Renaming of the cities, villages, other administrative units, changing Ukrainian road signs, streets into Russian ones, requiring cultural events, expression at schools, universities, and local history museums to reflect Russian history and narratives. Occupying forces have replaced these books from the books from Russia, which teach students that Russia is their homeland and deny their Ukrainian identity. This policy will continue until the Ukrainian identity, the hope, is destroyed. But we will prevent it, and we will fight. Dear friends, as I mentioned, the Russian Federation is using cultural cleansing as a weapon of war within its broader campaign of extreme violence. Such cultural erasure and the deliberate and systematic destruction or looting of cultural property amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity, and also reveal, together with the official rhetoric of the Russian Federation to justify its war of aggression, a specific genocidal intent to destroy the Ukrainian national group, or at least part of it, notably through the destruction of Ukrainian identity and culture. It is part of the broader campaign of genocide being pursued by the Russian Federation against Ukraine and against Ukrainian people. And of course, in my report, I talk about the legal response. We do have the Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property, and we have the Geneva Convention relative to the protection of civilian persons. But of course, there are loopholes. We have to find legal ways to close them. Of course, we need to strengthen respective domestic legal framework, and of course, we need to find a way to support for Ukraine, to give some aid for reconstruction. And I'm really pleased that for the first time during organizing the recovery conference, this time in Berlin, there was a separate panel regarding cultural heritage and how we can rebuild it, how we can keep it, how we can protect it. And of course, the best way is to have some 5 more Patriot systems, I would say, to protect not just people, cultural heritage, but everything in Ukraine. To conclude, of course Russia wants to destroy us. Of course they want to kill us physically. Of course they want to erase that we are Ukrainians. That's why they're doing it with these children that were taken to Russia. They changed their birth certificates, they changed their names, and they forbid to call them Ukrainians. But we will win, we will fight, and we will win. Because you know what is the name of this book from Kharkiv? It says, "Fight, do not give up." Thank you.
Thank you, dear Evgenia. I would now like to welcome Mr. Michael O'Flaherty, Commissioner for Human Rights of the Council of Europe. Before I give you the floor, I would like to say that this is his first speech in front of the Assembly that elected Mr. O'Flaherty, and I would add that he had visited many times Ukraine even before he was elected and after, as far as I know. Mr. O'Flaherty, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
President, thank you, honourable members. It's a great pleasure. It's an honour to be here. I thank you for the trust you've invested in me. Ukraine is my top priority, standing up for the human rights of its people. And it's for that reason it was the first country I visited when I took up my mandate in April. I have 5 preoccupations right now, which in large part echo the words of the rapporteurs. The first has to do with the children relocated, taken to Russia. We have got to keep the situation, the plight of these children, at the very top of our international political agendas, while of course welcoming all the efforts currently being taken at the behest of the Ukrainian authorities. Secondly, we must not forget the situation of people living in the temporarily occupied territories. The human rights situation is deplorable. It was well captured in a recent report of the United Nations. We have journalists here today in Strasbourg who have spoken about the plight of journalists in the occupied territories. As we keep our attention, let's not forget Crimea, already occupied for a number of years, and remember the particular situation of the Tatar people, who were the subject of an important report by my predecessor, Dunya Mijatovic. Third, we need to address the immediate humanitarian needs of Ukraine. They cannot wait for the end of conflict. And so we need to find the resources and the capacity to rebuild schools and to provide housing for internally displaced persons. Next, it is important, as the rapporteurs say, to keep a strong focus on criminal accountability. I welcome the new ICC indictments. I also welcome the initiatives towards the development of a tribunal on the crime of aggression. For me, it doesn't matter what form it takes, where it's housed. My concern is to make sure that it respects human rights, above all the rights of victims and witnesses. I would strongly encourage Ukraine to speedily ratify the Rome Statute of the ICC. And we must all keep an eye on the register of damages and the future compensation mechanisms to make sure that they are not just about reconstruction, but they are about delivering victim-centred justice. Fifth and finally, I would encourage that every effort be made to embed human rights in efforts and initiatives for peace and reconstruction. I welcome the outcomes of the recent conferences in Berlin and Lucerne. However, I would welcome a much more specific and explicit reference to human rights systems and institutions and standards indeed, because the explicit engagement of these elements will lead to what will prove to be better and more durable outcomes. And Mr. President, honourable members, allow me to conclude there with an assurance that I will continue to pay high attention to the human rights of the people of Ukraine, and I look forward to doing so in a very close cooperation with this Assembly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. O'Flaherty, for your most interesting address. We will have the opportunity to meet each other many times. Let me take the opportunity to congratulate you once again and to wish you the best for your new duties, which you are aligned in all your life, as I know. You are always serving human rights. So you are always welcome in this assembly, and we will be interested in listening to your views and, of course, to your experience from now on. Dear colleagues, the ballots for judges to the European Court of Human Rights are still open. Those who have not yet voted may still do so by going to the lobby of the Committee of Ministers. The vote will close 5 minutes after 12 p.m. And now I open the debate, the list of speakers. On behalf of the Socialists, I'll call Mr. Sefer.
Herr Präsident, liebe Kolleginnen und
Colleagues, President, the Socialist group, the Democrats here, support these ever so important reports, and it's a tradition in this House that we move forward with decisiveness on this particular path. But here we have something very, very special. We're speaking about the we have to, at this point, recognize the mistakes that have been made in this House. There were mistakes as far as the way the majority moved forward. The mistake involved the Russian Federation taking the Red Invasion in, and of course what is most difficult for politicians is to admit any mistakes that they've made in the past. And we admit this mistake by admitting it and understanding that there are certain consequences, because when we verbalize this, then we emphasize once again what is going on here. War is terrible, but here we're speaking about the extinguishing of a country, of an ethnic, cultural identity, of history as well. And I, as a German, say very clearly there is one example in the last 100 years where something very similar took place. When on the 1st of September 1939, Hitler began to act in this particular fashion and began to extinguish peoples. So this particular report will serve to help us understand exactly what our task is here in this House, what the purpose is of our discussions and of our deliberations. And these reports are a requirement. They serve as a sign that what is required of us is to work together so that we make sure that these events don't continue in the fashion that they have developed up until now. And that absolutely clear is the survival of Ukraine. And let me say this once again personally now. Our partner city for Bochum is Donetsk. And for 20 years ago, I was there with Kilionen. We were there as observers, election observers, and 20 years later, we are fighting together for one thing, for the survival of this city, of this country, of this culture. We'll do everything so that with these wonderful reports, we contribute to the survival of the Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sefer. On behalf of EPP, I call now Mr. Zingeris.
Today is a historical day for our assembly. Finally, we are assembled here for this pre-Nuremberg trial, even not having victory against this most terrible aggression against us, against Europe. It's not only aggression against Ukraine, it's aggression against us, all of us. The war declared from Moscow is against our democratic system. My colleague from Social Democratic Party just mentioned to all of you about 8 years we struggle in this chamber to delete Russian delegation, Mr. Tolstoy, Mr. Slutsky, and other guys who in front of me, looking to Karamurza, who was sitting here, they declare, you will be in our jail to Karamurza very soon, and you will be eliminated from Russian life. So first, they eliminated Russian Democrats and killed them one by one. Second, they would like to annihilate it, and they would like to annihilate neighboring countries who possess democratic system. Why they invaded Ukraine? Well, the Ukraine possessed democratic system and showed for the world that other life is possible. Even part of Ukrainians are speaking Russian. That was deadly danger for Putin regime to see these Russian-speaking Ukrainians who are in connections with the enslaved, captive Russians in Russia Federation, and the bacteria of freedom, what they so afraid, were dangerous, so that they make a decision to invite and kill Ukrainians while they are free, and they have free and fair elections. That is the reason when Mr. Putin told to Mr. Yanukovych, 2013, 28th of November, when Lithuania, during the chairmanship of European Union, invited the Ukraine to become a member of associated agreement with the European Union. That was the key issue, that Mr. Putin make a call in front of all delegations and tell to Mr. Yanukovych, if you will sign, you will be eliminated. For association agreement with the European Union. It was not NATO, it was Union. In this case, today we are celebrating. I'm so glad, looking to Madame Kravchuk and Lisa Yaskova and all members of Ukraine delegation, the European Union just opened the negotiations about your future membership in the European Union. That is the answer to not President Putin, and will be from our side, remembering what Martin Luther did, putting on front of the church all list of the commitments, new Reformed German Evangelic Church, the list of shame, Madam Lisa, list of shame of all our firms, Lithuanian, Greece, Italian, and others, who are doing business with Russia and supplying Russian military with the supply elements. If you remember, President Teo, inside of our Vilnius conference, the biggest report was by Lithuanian General Prosecutor. It was about the essence that Russian FSB is taking on the hook our firms, and making them agents of influence. So the firms, it's not only avoiding sanctions, not only circumventing the sanctions, becoming permanent system of agents of Russia. From my point of view, we should organize this open list of the shame of all our firms who are contradicting the sanctions. It should be open. Thank you.
Thank you, Emanuelis. Thank you. Thank you. On behalf of the European Conservatives, Mr. Goncharenko.
Thank you, dear Chair. Let us have a serious talk. Yes, Russian Empire is a colossus on clay feet. But besides these clay feet, and the reason why they still exist, is that they have three pillars: gas, oil, steel. This is the reality. And after more than 2 years of a full-scale invasion, after more than 10 years of war in Ukraine, what we see from the point of view of sanctions. In May, so last month, Russia became again #1 gas supplier to European Union, more than the United States of America, liquefied natural gas. And I want to remind you that Russia earns just from gas $100 billion per year. And part of this, big part, still comes from Europe. And Russian military budget is almost the same number, a little bit more than $100 billion. For comparison, after 2 years of debates, finally, European countries made a decision, and G7 made a decision, that the dividends from Russian frozen assets will go to Ukraine. And the first tranche will be $1.4 billion. $1 billion. And Russia receives from gas $100 billion. And we're saying, why the war continues? Let's go further. Steel. Russia steel is sending to Europe, no, not steel, but semi-products, steel slabs, pig ore, iron ore. And like they use it, and they're receiving billions of euros from this. Just in December, November of last year, 500,000 tons of steel slabs from Russia entered European market. And by the way, on a very cheap prices, killing European metallurgical industry. And then you're asking, why Europe can't produce shells and tanks and everything needed to stop aggressor? Because Russia is destroying European metallurgical industry, spitting on any ecological norms in their country, not giving possibility to support ecology and environment here, and destroying capacity, industrial capacity of Europe. And it's still happening. Russian tycoons, oligarchs, are still becoming more and more rich. And there is no tycoons in Russia. These are all different pockets of Putin. Mr. Lysin, #1 person, the richest Russian man officially, so it means the deepest pocket of Putin, is not under sanctions anywhere. Why? Because he owns the small factory in Belgium. And I spoke with Belgian Prime Minister, and he told, 500 people work there. We can't do anything with this. I think Belgium can deal with 500 people. Let's help these people, but not let them to be hostages of Putin and using them to continue this awful war. And still, Mr. Lysin is not under sanctions. So what should be done? Russian gas should be completely banned here in Europe. Russian steel should be completely banned. Russian semi-products of steel, steel slabs, iron ore, pig ore, everything should be completely banned here. Because now it's crazy. Russia is receiving this money, and then from this money they finance terrorist attacks, sabotage in Berlin, killing in Salisbury, everywhere. So are we crazy here? Or we finally will make a real lessons and stop this hell? Thank you.
Thank you, Alexei. On behalf of ALDE, Mr. Damien Coutier. Damien.
Merci, Monsieur le...
Thank you very much indeed, President. The crime of aggression is the worst of all crimes because it includes triggering of other crimes, and this is what the Assembly noted last year based on the report that I was honoured enough to present to you. I'd like to thank Mr. Stier for referring to this report and to following up on this important report. And as he stated, unfortunately, the situation is not improved. In fact, it's got far worse, and it's all the more important for the international community to take action, in particular the Council of Europe and countries concerned. I'd like to thank the three rapporteurs. We have three reports with us here today. They're all excellent and detailed reports, and I must confess it's quite a challenge. It's certainly quite frustrating to talk on all these three reports within 2 minutes speaking time because we would need far more time to do this. Mr. Stier reminded us of the importance of different legal tools, international legal tools that already exist. For instance, the damage register, which was set up, and we need to continue to promote this damage register and ensure that it's fully implemented. And we should also continue to work on what is stated in the report as well. That is the follow-up that's needed. And with regard to the ad hoc tribunal for the crime of aggression, our Assembly was the first body to call for this to be created, and this needs now to be put into place. Now, should this be done in the form of a specific agreement between the Council of Europe and Ukraine, or in a large partial agreement? Was this the best solution? I don't know. But it's certainly the most realistic one at the moment, the most possible one that can enable us to make proper headway. And I think on behalf of the ALDE group, it's this process we want to follow and support. With all the efforts that have been carried out. Why is it not the best solution? Well, because, as I was saying, a decision would need to have been taken by the General Assembly of the United Nations. We need for there to be as broad support as possible. We haven't currently reached this particular situation, this particular stage, but I certainly think we can hope there is going to be further support in future from the General Assembly. This is a very good avenue we can explore. I'd like to congratulate the rapporteur for this. I'd like to express my satisfaction that we heard from the Human Rights Commissioner. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Flaherty, for addressing us. You committed to have an ongoing dialogue with us at the Parliamentary Assembly, and things are taking place here, and it's the second time we met you this week, and I think it's certainly a new way of working, and I'd like to commend this. We're talking about the conflict in Ukraine. Of course, that's one of your absolute priority areas. And I'm delighted that the new Secretary-General that we elected yesterday has also taken a very clear position in his very first declaration on Ukraine. It would be his utmost priority. And the mechanisms we're talking about today are certainly avenues that can be explored by all the different bodies of the Council of Europe. I'd like to also congratulate the two other rapporteurs, Mrs. Jasko and Mrs. Kravchuk, for their excellent reports, which share information on the role of sanctions. And we need to be very careful with regard to the legal side of things, of course. We want to ensure that procedures are carried out that can't be attacked as such. We're here to defend and share values. We want to ensure we come up with the proper solutions, and states need to be aware of this, and I think they are. And Ms. Kravchuk, what you've been saying is ever so important with regard to cultural identity. There are already international standards in this area. I think we need to be developed further, and we'll certainly support within the ALDE group your proposals with this in mind. Thank you very much indeed.
On behalf of the United European Left, Mr. Paul Gavan. Paul, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to congratulate all three rapporteurs. As the last speaker said, it's very difficult to actually respond to all three reports in just 3 minutes. But I'm probably going to focus on the report on sanctions because I have a particular interest in that issue. Just to be clear, first and foremost, Russia's war in Ukraine is a blatant breach of international law and full-scale aggression of the Russian military against the people of Ukraine, and it has to be condemned. I believe in sanctions. I'm old enough to remember the sanctions that were proved effective against the old apartheid regime in South Africa many decades ago. So sanctions are very important. The European Union onto its 14th round of sanctions at this stage. And yet we know, and other speakers have highlighted already, that there are, and the report highlights the gaps and loopholes, very significant gaps and loopholes. And I suppose I'll start with my own country, and our government has been very supportive of the Ukrainian people. But the Irish Financial Services Centre is awash with billions of Russian money belonging to oligarchs. And indeed, the head of the Money Laundering Association in the Department of Finance has conceded that the laws we have are simply not effective. Not effective, so that money is still washing around, still going to the oligarchs. So we certainly need to really address this issue. As Mr. Goncharenko said, there are huge gaps, and I mean, again, I could mention any country, but I suppose the one, and it's not particularly picking on Germany, but it is extraordinary to see how many German firms are still active in Russia. 63 German firms, including Siemens, Bayer, and Stork. Two of Germany's largest lenders, Commerzbank and Deutsche Bank, also active in Russia still. And customs data indicated that 28 Maybach luxury cars made by German firm Mercedes-Benz entered into Belarus last year, most likely en route to Russia, according to Financial Times. So sanctions have to be effective. That's the key message. And there are a number of recommendations in the report, all of which are worthy of consideration. The view of the United European Left is that we must continue to support any and all actions against perpetrators of war crimes, regardless of who they are, by imposing sanctions and using the multilateral institutions such as the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice as mechanisms to hold aggressors to account. But here I have to come to the elephant in the room. And the elephant is this. We support sanctions 100% against Russia. But why is there no conversation about sanctions against Israel? 35,000 human beings have now been slaughtered, 75% of whom are women and children. We undermine the credibility of this institution while we continue to refuse to talk about the necessity of sanctions against the genocide that is ongoing against the Palestinian people. We need to address that issue.
Thank you, Paul. In the debate, I call next Petra Bayer.
Danke, Herr Präsident.
Thank you very much, President. For those who have followed closely the terrible things happening in Russia, when we look at what's taking place at, of course, numerous different levels, then we contemplate the role of the international court, an international court, a tribunal of Gerasimov and the former Minister of Defense, Shoigu. They have now been accused of committing international crimes, war atrocities, and the same has to take place for others in the leadership in Russia. The Madam Maria Lvova-Bolova, who is the ombudsman for children, she is now being accused of the kidnapping, massive kidnapping of children from Ukraine, having sent them to Belarus and to Russia as well. It's extremely to understand that these particular arrest orders that have been issued, that they be followed up very closely. Very important, of course, to sign and ratify the Rome Convention on this particular issue. So the participation of all is extremely important so that there is a proper taking of stock of the situation and making sure that these individuals come before justice. Also, one has to look at the consequences at the individual level. In other words, the terrible mental scars, the terrible physical scars, the suffering that has been created and generated by this regime and by these individuals as well. The sexualization of violence, of war crimes of a sexual nature as well. There has to be special attention paid to this as well. The weaponization, in other words, of this particular issue. So, indeed, the means have to exist, the legal implements in order to be able to prosecute on this particular front. And also, the judges and the role that parliaments play, national parliaments, as far as the way the judicial systems function and the cooperation that exists between these two branches as well. This has to be taken into consideration. What can be done? And here, if you have the opportunity to elect look at the role of the judges, particularly those who are up for there's candidacies now from Finland and from Austria, really make it clear to them after the election the role that they must play in this entire process, because there are important recommendations that have to be followed by the court here, and it is a wonderful example to set for the International War Crimes Tribunal as well. Thank you.
Bevica, EPP. You have the floor.
Thank you, President. Dear colleagues, first let me thank all the rapporteurs and all experts in the different committees for the dedicated work to develop these very important reports. Regarding the report, legal and human rights aspects of the Russian Federation's aggression against Ukraine, I would like to underline a few concrete topics that are covered in this report. First, only if comprehensive accountability is ensured, current international rules-based order can be safeguarded. A special tribunal has to be established now. I'm positive about the suggestion to establish a special tribunal under auspices of the Council of Europe, but what is important, it should enjoy cross-regional support and be able to prosecute the main perpetrators of the crime of aggression. For Latvia, it is of utmost importance that the special tribunal is effective, precludes impunity, ensures justice for Ukraine, and serves as a deterrent for future aggressions, as well as upholds rules-based international order. Second, all international crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, as mentioned in Para 14, has to be examined, and perpetrators have to be sentenced. As of yesterday, the ICC has issued arrest warrants against Sergei Shoigu and Valery Gerasimov. We can definitely add their names in the list of wanted. Third, I would like to underline Para 15 of the resolution, and especially regarding frozen Russian state assets. We have established damage register, and Riga principles are adopted to ensure the efficient functioning of the register. With this report and previously approved report on the support to the reconstruction of Ukraine, we have created a legal basis how to legally confiscate and transfer the frozen Russian state assets to Ukraine. Now, it depends on the will and courage of the governments to carry out. Dear colleagues, we are discussing two other very important reports. All these aspects are of utmost importance. A few days ago, the European Union adopted the 14th package of sanctions against Russia for its continued illegal war against Ukraine. It is clear that the sanctions and our unity have to reduce Russian financial and military capacities. Meanwhile, we have to continue to strengthen sanction regimes and prevent any loopholes. Many countries are following closely our reaction, and if our response won't be strong, I'm afraid that in the near future we will have much more aggression around the globe. And to conclude, regarding erasure of the cultural identity and Russification policy, unfortunately these are Russia's usual practices that as well my country has experienced through occupation period and centuries before as well. Indeed, the Russian Federation is using cultural cleansing as a weapon of war within its broader campaign of extreme violence. To raise historical roots, values, traditions, and language, it is Russia's approach, not only in its neighboring countries, but as well inside itself. Thank you, dear colleagues.
Thank you. Next speaker is for 3 minutes, Olena Komenko.
Fellow colleagues, today in this hemicycle we have a comprehensive and historic debate covering the issues of critical importance for Ukrainians. I commend The tremendous work done by the rapporteurs Evgenia, Elizaveta, and Davor to focus on terrible Russian war crimes and the erasure of our national identity, as well as the importance of responsibility for them and justice for the people of Ukraine. One of the gravest atrocities committed in this war is the forced deportation of Ukrainian children, which is followed by the systematic eradication of children's national identity through the Russification, militarization, and indoctrination, through burning Ukrainian books, banning Ukrainian language at schools, and systematic denial of the existence of Ukraine as an independent state and Ukrainians as a nation. The illegal abduction and transfer of Ukrainian children is not only a crime against humanity, but an assault on the future of Ukraine. As time goes on, these children lose their connection with home and culture, and some may even be drafted into the enemy's military machine. And not only Putin and Vova Belova are responsible for these grave crimes. There is a huge network of criminals in Russia, including governmental officials, executing this systematic policy. Sanctions are a crucial tool in our arsenal to weaken the Russian military machine and hold those responsible accountable. However, half measures and superficial sanctions that merely tick the box are insufficient. They enable the enemy's military capabilities to persist and do not reflect the gravity of our commitment. Our current sanctions regime must be strengthened to close the gaps and loopholes that Russian atrocities exploit. This includes expanding the scope of sanctions to target critical sectors such as telecommunications and other sections, and ensuring comprehensive international coordination to prevent circumvention. Our actions must reflect our resolve. Anything less is tantamount to complicity. For all the Ukrainians, time is of essence to manage all the consequences caused by Russian Federation. This means not only imposing and enforcing sanctions, but also providing all the necessary military and humanitarian support to ensure their survival and victory. The longer we hesitate, the more entrenched the aggressor becomes, and the more lives are lost. The recent peace summit underscored the necessity of a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace. Key aspects include the necessity to exchange all prisoners of war and to return all deported and unlawfully displaced Ukrainian children, and all other Ukrainian civilians who were unlawfully detained must be returned to Ukraine. Help us deliver this peace agenda and ensure this just and lasting peace. We need to push to put more pressure and more sanctions on Russia. Thank you, dear colleagues.
Thank you. Next speaker is Roland Büchel for ALDE.
Herr Vorsitzender, geschätzte Kolleginnen und Kollegen, es tut mir
President, colleagues, now we have heard that sanctions are the panacea, that they will resolve the situation.
Speaker Paul Gavin hat soeben gesagt.
Mr. Gavin said that more sanctions, and called for more sanctions. Germany has been accused of not implementing enough sanctions. Other countries as well have been accused of that. Now, do you really think that sanctions against Russia will solve the situation? Are you sure that stopping the export of oil and gas, that Russia will fall to its knees because of this? There are many economists, many people have said that this is not the way to go. Why ought we not act in other fashions as well? The sanctions have not worked. They will not work. The Russian economy, unfortunately, has become stronger. And what's happening in our countries, the people, the man on the street, because of inflation, can't pay for things. So the sanctions seem to be, there seems to be a boomerang effect. They seem to be working against us. So I don't think that it has worked. We have to work in a different fashion. And people have called for more sanctions, but it won't work in the way that we want. This striving for more sanctions is not good. It will not help us. It will not help us to fight the enemy, to fight Russia. And it will, on the other hand, make the lives of our citizens more difficult. And that's why I feel that the path of sanctions and calling for more sanctions, I feel that that's not the wrong, that is the wrong path to follow.
Kolatian.
Mr. President, colleagues, very comprehensive, detailed, objective, very good reports. I would like to congratulate all three rapporteurs for their wonderful, very professional work. I will focus in my brief intervention especially on the issue of accountability for the crimes committed by Russia and its political and military leaders, and I make reference to the crime of aggression, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. Davor Stier, but also Mrs. Yashko and Mrs. Kravchuk are describing very accurate the atrocities committed by Russia in and against Ukraine and the Ukrainian nation, atrocities that have caused horrible crimes, death, destruction, environmental damage, and massive displacement of the population within and outside Ukraine. I quoted from the first report. The issue of accountability is the key element in our discussion because all these crimes are violating the foundation of the international society as established by the UN Charter in 1945. The consequence is the fact that for all of us there is a key obligation to react, to confirm the accountability for these crimes and to reject the impunity and not to accept the fact that the use and the illegal use of force can be interpreted as an alternative to the normal functioning of the international society based on rules. So accountability and the establishment of a special tribunal for punishing the crime of aggression is a key element in our discussion. I would like to underline in this context that the original source of the crime of aggression as established in the international law is the London Convention for defining the crime of aggression from 1933. At the time, it was the Romanian Foreign Minister Nicolae Titulescu and, paradoxically, the Soviet Commissioner Maxim Litvinov that jointly proposed the first ever international definition of the crime of aggression. And this was the source that, by the way, was used on March 3rd, 2014 in Brussels by the foreign ministers of the European Union in condemning Russia for the illegal annexation of Crimea for the crime of aggression. So I really hope that what is proposed and underlined in the report of Davor Stier, for instance, the special role of the Council of Europe currently, which is played for drafting and negotiating and finalizing a bilateral agreement between the Council of Europe and Ukraine, plus an enlarged and partial agreement that will accompany, that will open the doors for the other members of the international society will become a reality. I underline that this is a European platform and the European solution provided for all the international society to be part of the process and to sanction the crime of aggression. I really hope that in my country, in Romania, and in Bucharest, in the second part of this week, my country, which is a strong supporter and contributor to this process, the core group will finalize, or at least will advance substantially to finalize these agreements, and definitely to underline also the need to establish an even more stronger regime of the sanctions and to be sure that at the end the system of compensation for the damages will be put in place. So I will strongly support and vote in favor of the adoption of all three resolutions and the draft recommendation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and the floor goes to your neighbor, Mrs. Christopherson.
President, dear colleagues, Russia's aggressive warfare against Ukraine is now in its third year. All our member states share an undeniable obligation to support Ukraine in their heroic resistance against the aggressor. Ukraine's fight is our fight. In fact, their fight is the fight for a democratic Europe where people can live their lives in freedom. It's a fight for the core values of the Council of Europe. Thus, we are all obliged to, with all means, continue our support for Ukraine. For the time being, the support is primarily military in the forms of arms deliveries and their use. Even if this is not up for debate today, I would like to mention that Norway just opened a new missile factory, partly to replenish our own stocks after donations to Ukraine, and partly to continue supplying Ukraine with modern missile systems. Today, we have before us 3 reports addressing different aspects of our support for Ukraine. They deal with war and reparations, the establishment of a criminal tribunal under the auspices of the Council of Europe, and protection of Ukrainian cultural identity and heritage, all important reports. Nevertheless, I believe the most important thing right now is that we do everything we can to enforce the sanctions imposed on Russia. We need to get more countries involved, close loopholes, and most of all, ensure that the adopted sanctions actually are enforced. To weaken Russia's economic ability as much as possible is of utmost importance. Unfortunately, the Norwegian Helsinki Committee has uncovered many violations of the sanction regimes. Their report shows how large quantities of sanctioned war-relevant goods flow directly from Europe to Russia. Turkey is a key gateway. In addition, some Western countries stand for large direct outflows of sanctioned goods, including Poland, Germany, and Lithuania, the latter shipping sanctioned goods partly via Belarus. I hope this is not the top of an iceberg. As parliamentarians, we have an obligation to check the status of sanction enforcement back home. Finally, a tribunal under the Council of Europe's auspices might be a good idea. Seizure of frozen Russian assets is a difficult issue which may take time to resolve. Meanwhile, all member states of the Council of Europe should make a common agreement on financial contributions to rebuild Ukraine when this terrible war is over, hopefully soon. Thank you.
Now, Mr. Loring Naxa has the floor. You have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. President. First of all, I think, as anyone in this room, Hungary condemns Russia's military aggression against Ukraine. We think that war cannot be a solution to any conflict. In these turbulent times of war, Hungary has shown its solidarity and is supporting Ukraine in various ways. In addition to the significant humanitarian aid response, such as relief, rehabilitation and development operations providing Ukraine, including helping internally displaced persons, we are providing ongoing assistance to refugees arriving to Hungary from Ukraine. Just yesterday, 10,800 persons arrived to Hungary. We are committed to the development of our multifaceted cooperation with Ukraine. Ukraine is our important partner and neighbor and home to a considerable Hungarian minority group. Of course, their minority rights are really important for us as well. Hungary is of the view that perpetrators of the most serious international crimes should be held accountable in a way that is consistent with the international law. The core group has no formal link with the Council of Europe and its statutory organs. Discussions within the Council of Europe should be transparent, especially as some member states, including Hungary, are not participating in the work of the core group. And any involvement of the Council of Europe beyond its current mandate in the process leading to the possible establishment of a special tribunal and others should be based on a unanimous decision of the member states of the Council of Europe. On the other hand, we are of the firm opinion that national sanctions can only be imposed by the elected political representatives of the country concerned. These decisions form a part of a country's foreign policy competence firmly rooted in its national sovereignty. Hungary is interested in a peaceful resolution of the devastating conflict in the heart of Europe as soon as possible. That's why we support all initiatives aiming at starting meaningful negotiations. Peace cannot be achieved without dialogue. That's why we participated at the Swiss Peace Conference. Ladies and gentlemen, we want peace as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now has the floor Mrs. Jordanova.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dear colleagues, first of all, I would like to congratulate all our three rapporteurs for the excellent work. I will focus on the issue of sanctions in my short intervention. First, allow me to disagree with the fact that the sanctions don't work. Yes, they are not the most effective tool to end this horrible war. But we need them, because for the moment they are the only effective, peaceful tool at our disposal. That's why I think that we should unite the efforts of our governments, of our companies, and to effectively implement all sanctions, strengthen them, widen them. Earlier this week, the European Union adopted the 14th package of sanctions against the Kremlin regime, with European political parties and non-governmental organizations now banned from accepting financial contributions from Moscow. In addition, the EU forbids the use of its facilities for transshipment of Russian liquid natural gas and its re-export to third countries, while also adding further 116 individuals and entities to existing sanctions list. The package bans 27 Russian ships from docking at European ports and foresees additional bans on financial operation and obligation for the European companies exporting military equipment and weapons to the Russian Federation. Launching the deadliest and the most destructive military campaign in Europe since World War II has turned Russia into a pariah state which deserves even stronger economic and diplomatic isolation. Sanctions remain the much-needed peaceful tool for maximum disturbance of Putin's war machine, thus preventing it from killing more innocent civilians and destroying Ukraine's critical infrastructure. Weakening or even helping Russia evade the sanctions costs numerous lives and represents a serious threat for the security of Europe. Therefore, I call representatives of member states that refrain from restrictive measures to reconsider their policy and also impose all the existing sanctions against Kremlin. We should examine all legal avenues to expropriate frozen recent assets and use them for recovery of Ukraine and the well-being of its citizens. I also support the creation of international tribunal that will punish the criminals from the Putin's regime. And all my dear colleagues, I urge you to speed up the process. Thank you.
Thank you. On place number 209, it's not Mr. Kleinwächter. So he is not there. Then is the next speaker, Mr. Mamiyanyan, EPP. Yes, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Honourable colleagues, I would like to add some more facts to those that have been presented by the rapporteur in the paragraph about South Caucasus. Because systematic obliteration of a rich and ancient heritage of Armenia is not only a cultural tragedy, but also a flagrant violation of international law and human rights.
12.
The Armenian cultural identity is deeply rooted in the history of the South Caucasus. However, the legacy has been increasingly under threat, particularly in the context of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. The Caucasus Heritage Watch, an organization monitoring cultural heritage in conflict zones, has provided comprehensive documentations on the matter. Saint Yerishe Arakel Monastery, the 9th century Armenian monastery, has been significantly damaged. Photographic evidence from 2023 shows the removal of Armenian inscriptions and the defacement of the religious symbols. The destruction is a part of a broader pattern observed in the territories that came under Azerbaijani control after 2020 war. Shushi Cathedral, Kazanchetsotz, the iconic cathedral which was shelled during the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war. Despite international calls for its protection, the site has been further neglected and damaged in 2023. Satellite images confirmed the deterioration of the important cultural landmark. There are sources claiming that Azerbaijan is trying to wipe out Armenian origins of it and turning it into so-called Albanian monastery. St. John the Baptist Church, Kanachjam, located in Shushi. This church has been subjected to repeated vandalism. In 2023, reports indicated that the church's dome and cross has been removed and its interior desecrated. The Astvatsatin Church, another significant site. The Astvatsatin Church is in Hadrut district, has been repurposed with the Azerbaijani authorities convening into a mosque, erasing the Armenian Christian heritage. Azerbaijani authorities won't stop on that. They didn't stop till they ethnically cleansed Nagorno-Karabakh, where there is not a single Armenian at the moment. I'm sure that sooner or later the right of self-determination of Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh will be exercised as agreed and announced 5 times by the heads of states of Minsk Group co-chair countries. Azerbaijani authorities are afraid of that, as they should be. And the fear transferred into aggression towards people, monasteries, and cultural sites. The preservation of cultural heritage is a collective responsibility. By safeguarding the Armenian heritage, we uphold the principles of cultural diversity, historical integrity, and international law. Let us stand united our commitment to protect and preserve the cultural identity of all nations, ensuring that history, no matter how vulnerable, is never forgotten. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Claude Kern.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear colleagues, I should like to thank our 3 colleagues for their excellent reports concerning the war of aggression undertaken by the Russian Federation against Ukraine that we condemn now and always. I should like also especially to bring up the report put forth by our colleague Davor Ivo-Stier, which pleads for the setting up of a full system to establish responsibilities for all violations of international law and international crimes that stem from the Russian Federation's aggression against Ukraine. We unfortunately know that crimes and other forms of ill treatment or abuse have been and will go on being very many. Establishing the responsibility of those who are guilty, to my way of thinking, as an indispensable step to establish, when the time comes, a lasting peace. Our Assembly was the first international body to support the creation of an ad hoc international criminal court to investigate and prosecute crimes of aggression committed against Ukraine. This position of principle has been unwavering. We still need to consider the ways and means, especially for the Council of Europe, to take part in this, while consultations on the subject are still underway between member states of the Council of Europe and other partners in the core group. The Council of Europe undeniably has an essential role to play. The European Court of Human Rights has a great experience to bring to bear. At the Reykjavik summit, the damage register for Ukraine was created, which was a first step toward an international mechanism to indemnify victims of Russian aggression. Finally, the Secretary General of the Council of Europe received a mandate from the Committee of the Ministers on last April 30th to prepare all necessary documents for a possible draft agreement between the Council of Europe and the government of Ukraine concerning the creation of the Special Court. Also received a mandate to prepare a possible draft agreement, partial agreement, which would be an enlarged agreement dealing with the ways and means in which such a tribunal might be supported and financed, as well as other administrative issues. I'm very pleased that the Council of Europe is taking this initiative, consistent with positions that our Assembly has previously expressed. Nonetheless, and the report emphasizes this, it seems to me essential that the special tribunal be as international as possible, above and beyond the limits of the Council of Europe. with our values and important experience here in the Council of Europe, we need to plead for the greatest possible internationalization of this court so that it takes on the most universal dimension possible. I thank you for your attention.
Merci. May I remind the colleagues that the ballots for judges to the European Court of Human Rights are still open. Those who have not yet voted may still do so by going to the lobby of the Committee of Ministers. The vote closes at 12:05. So, next speaker is George Fulks.
Mr. President, most people have difficulty pronouncing my name, so I forgive you. These are three excellent reports. I'm going to concentrate on the one on sanctions. Now, Britain is committed to supporting Ukraine in every way possible against the illegal Russian aggression. But I must say I'm disappointed in the lack of progress we've had so far in having effective sanctions. And unlike Mr. Bochel from Switzerland, he's disappeared, Mr. Bochel from Switzerland, I do believe sanctions can be effective. The reason why they haven't been effective so far in crippling the Russian economy is because we haven't imposed them fully and effectively. Now, if we take Britain, for example, we are lagging behind both the United States and the European Union. And our problem with our approach is twofold. The scope of sanctions remains far too limited, and the sanctions that we do have are undermined by lack of effective enforcement. On scope, the excellent Spotlight on Corruption recently submitted evidence to our Parliament which highlighted the fact that Britain currently only sanctions 14% of the individuals name-checked on the Anti-Corruption Foundation's Navalny list. That's not an effective implementation. Also, there is still significant divergence between our sanctions and those of our allies. There are about 700 individuals on the US list and 500 on the EU list that we don't have on our list in the United Kingdom, and that's unacceptable. The UK government must do more to align with our allies, as sanctions can only be really effective if the scope of implementation is wide. And then on enforcement, that's failed due to a combination of underfunding and limiting the powers of our regulatory body, the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation. And since the outbreak of war, that body has issued no fines for sanctions evasion. That implies one of two scenarios. Either everyone is complying, or more likely nobody is being caught. We have to put more investment in OFSI, in this organization, and reform it to grant it criminal powers so that it can quickly transform this largely toothless body into an effective sanctions police. And I think sanctions must be an essential part, just a part, of our package of support for Ukraine, as crippling Russia financially can propel Ukraine from the current stalemate to victory. And as Lisa Christofferson rightly said, the Ukrainians are not just fighting for Ukraine, they're fighting for us and for all democracies. Thank you, Mr. President.
Now has the floor Mr. David Wells from Canada.
Dear colleagues, today's joint debate covers three distinct but interrelated subjects, and I thank all three rapporteurs for their good work. Given my limited time today, however, I'm going to focus on sanctions. Since 2014, the Canadian government has imposed sanctions on more than 784 entities and 2,190 individuals in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I say more than because that's government data from late February, and rarely a week goes by without a Canadian sanctions announcement. Indeed, from January 2022 to June 2023 alone, Canada imposed 79 rounds of autonomous sanctions, a 150% increase over the previous 5 years combined. For Canada, as for most of our allies, sanctions have become what some describe as a tool of first resort. And that makes sense. Sanctions are one of the very few nonviolent mechanisms we have to stand up for human rights and try to bring about change in policy and behavior. Unfortunately, though, at least in the Canadian context, there's a tendency to do what the sanctions expert Andrea Sharon has called fire and forget. We're good at adding individuals and entities, that's the easy part, but we struggle to enforce our sanctions, to crack down on evasion, and to measure their effectiveness. A big part of the problem is data. The Russian elites, proxies, and oligarchs, the Repo Task Force, a multilateral effort to isolate and exert pressure on sanctioned Russian individuals and entities, has acknowledged that problem. The Task Force March 2023 Global Advisory, for example, highlighted the fact that regulated private sector entities have access to very valuable information, such as customer and transaction details and trade documentation. This information, the advisory added, puts them on the front line in the fight against illicit finance and Russian sanctions evasions, and allows them to identify suspicious activity. The challenge, however, is that they often only have what the Repo Task Force described as a, quote, limited view of the underlying activity of concern, close quote. The data is out there, but we're operating in silos. We need to see more of it, and we need to share it. In the meantime, Russia continues to exploit globalized supply chains and third country traders to access components that are essential to its war efforts. It's extremely disappointing that countries like China, India, the UAE, and Turkey continue to trade with Russia. For the most part, that trade is beyond the reach of our sanctions and out of our control. What we can do, however, is ensure that our sanctions are working as well as they can be. Sunlight, as the saying goes, is the best disinfectant. Let's prioritize comprehensive, transparent data and do what we can to thwart sanctions evasion. Thank you.
So next speaker is Mrs. Bilozir. I can't see her. Oh yes, you'll speak from there. Okay.
Okay. Mr. Chair, dear colleagues, I would like to commend our reporters for their important reports. All of these topics are important and vital for Ukraine. I would like to thank Mr. Stier for stressing on a comprehensive system of accountability of violations and international crimes Russia has done. I would like to thank Elizaveta Yasko for her thorough report on sanctions with concrete propositions how to avoid circumventing sanctions. And I would like to thank Evgenia Kravchuk, who has been working on her report very hard since the beginning of the full-scale invasion to show how Russia is using cultural cleansing as a weapon of war. Thank you all today that you stand united with Ukraine in the face of many challenges of war waged by Russia that tests the very principle of international law and justice. But I would like to stress that still some Council of Europe countries help Russia to circumvent sanctions. Yesterday, Bloomberg has published charts where you could see that sanctions reduce only Russian import, but not Russian export that helps them to finance war. Moscow have received billions from the EU since the ban of Russian fuel imports to the EU. The scheme works as follows. Russia oil is refined, mixed with oils, products of other origin, as is still allowed by the EU if it is labeled as non-Russian. In addition, Russia has created a shadow fleet for oil export. We all heard about this in details today. Russians use different perverted ways of circumvent the sanctions. They use cryptocurrency to buy dual-use goods, including high-tech equipment and components for drones and for missiles. Are we not aware of this? That many European companies continue to do business freely in Russia, abusing the right to an exemption from sanction regime. Russia increased the production of arms in 2023 compared to 2022 in 3 times. It clearly shows how sanctions work. Do money really mean that much to civilized world, even more than basic human values? In case it is so, dear colleagues, we have to admit that axis of evil turned to be stronger than democratic world. We need a clear and transparent systematic formula for secondary sanctions against companies and countries. We must improve multilateral cooperation to ensure the elimination of legal loopholes. We have to invest in exchange of information and best practices, conduct joint inspections and investigations. After all, sanctions must be instrument of punishment of Russia on the path to justice and rule of law. Thank you.
Thank you. Now has the floor Mrs. Pacosta.
I would also give the very best words about these three reports, which are very important today. And I would like to underline the value of this organization where we sit, due to the fact that we take into the light all the aspects of human rights. For example, the tragedy of war and occupation in demolishing of the cultural identity, the cultural rights, is one of the aspects that is not very much up on the scope. So this is why I would like to say some more words about this. Estonia has experienced very lately by the Russian occupation, the demolishing of our culture, our cultural sites, our religious sites, and our identity. So I have personally experienced a lot of tragic what that involves, although I have not seen the war in my country. So the rights of identity and of culture are a little bit not tangible and a little bit abstract, and this is why they are quite often overseen, especially in the cultures which have not recently experienced this tragedy. But as we all understand the importance of the human rights, of the cultural rights, of the right to identity, we have to underline that this is the value war. This is the war of cultures. And because it is a war of cultures, we have to keep our culture, our values very strong in this. We have to take, together with UNESCO and other international organizations, every aspect on the light of demolishing of cultural identity and sites. And I would like to also underline that the Russian propaganda, especially in this area, we might think that something is sometimes true because they give so many aspects, they give so many historical so-called details, but we have to take into account everything they say can be right. Everything they say most often is wrong, and we have to see that their propaganda, Russia's propaganda, works in the way that they give very many so-called facts to make people believe that something is right, but no, everything can be wrong. We have to see it through. So I would like to call everybody here and outside of this building to work together to protect the cultural values of Ukraine, to protect the identity of Ukrainian children who are deported to Russia and Belarus, and to work not only with a tangible culture, but also with a culture that we can't touch. It is very important for protection of human rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now has the floor Lord David Blencathra.
First of all, on an international tribunal, this Council should move immediately to create one. In 1944, 4 countries, the United Kingdom, the United States, the Soviet Union and France, set up the Nuremberg Tribunal. There was no precedent, no rules to follow, but they made their own and justice was done. That is a model we should follow, since the rules of procedure can be replicated today. There will never be an international criminal court trial, since Russia and China will veto it. If some of our Council states do not want to participate, then so be it. We should still go ahead. And what should be the role of Ukraine? I am clear that they should be the lead prosecutor and assisted by others, but they cannot be on the judges' panel, since that would lead to claims of bias. Ukraine has the evidence, they should prosecute. There is no excuse for this Council to delay further. Let us crack on with setting up a tribunal as soon as possible. On sanctions, what an excellent report by Ms Jasko. I agree with every word of it, especially the measures she calls for in paragraphs 9 and 11 of the draft resolution. We have got to expose all those people and countries dealing with the evil Putin regime. Those countries in Europe still buying Russian oil and gas, those shadow shipping fleets moving their oil and gas to other evil regimes around the world. And we need to out the individuals and corporations still working with Russia. We need a new form of the Me Too movement. And just as all corporations now flood their annual reports, claiming how good they are about the environment and transsexual rights and people trafficking and every other cause, so I like the idea of having them to declare that they have no dealings with anything which aids the war against Ukraine. And we should support secondary sanctions against any people or countries aiding Putin. Sanctions only work if they hurt enough people. At the moment, they do not and should be strengthened. And Ms Kravchuk has also produced an excellent report, and it is clear that the victors from the earliest days of history always tried to eradicate the culture of the losing country. She documented that well for the Crimea, and we've seen Russia try that in the lands they've overrun in southern Ukraine. I support all our recommendations, but they require one thing for them to work: the defeat of Russia in Ukraine and for Ukraine to win. We can sign all the conventions we like and pass UN resolutions, but if we want to protect the Ukrainian identity, the Ukrainian language and culture, then we have to give them the weapons, the military weapons, to help them win. As Lord Fuchs so rightly said, Ukraine is fighting for all of us. Now, I know that this Assembly does not like talk of fighting to win. We prefer talk of peace. But when we pass these resolutions today, let us be clear that it will not work unless we help Ukraine win. And then the Ukraine will be in a position to restore once again its noble culture. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now the floor goes to Mr. Paulo Muniz. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Dear colleagues, my first words are for the three rapporteurs and to congratulate them. Since the aggression and invasion of Ukraine that began in 2014 and culminated with the full-scale invasion and war in February 2022, the forced Russification of the Ukrainian people has been severely imposed. The attack on the cultural identity, historical heritage and values and traditions, thoughts and genuine expressions of Ukrainian people have suffered deliberate actions of erasures and adulteration. This intangible offensive, which also strongly affects the entire digital, historical and online environment and media, leaves much deeper and more lasting marks than other scars. We must condemn this barbarity and attack on the soul and the essence of the Ukrainian people while demanding its reparation with all the costs involved and with international observation and monitoring mechanisms, and it must continue for as long as necessary for a complete reparation of the cultural and identity values attacked and destroyed by Putin regime. The evil must not prevail, and altogether we must ensure that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now the floor goes to Mr. Kimmo Kiljunen. The floor is yours.
Mr. President, thanks very much for these three excellent reports. Thanks very much for this very mature, important discussion we are having here today. Obviously, we all are focusing on the brutal aggression Russia made against independent sovereign state of Ukraine. We are now discussing here with serious consequences what has happened
And obviously the key is to keep those accountable who are behind of this brutal aggression. We are in full solidarity here together, and that's why the items we are discussing are serious. Thanks for the debate on sanctions. Yes, they are not totally functional. There are always hiccups on those, but as Bulgarian representative here today said, that's the most efficient, peaceful way of trying to influence. True, we are discussing here about the damage register, how to compensation mechanisms to be created, and also the tribunals which are obviously waiting against those ones who are guilty for war crimes. Colleagues, actually this platform here, our plenary assembly, is the widest and most credible European parliamentary forum to have the debate. True, the debate goes also in European Parliament in next door. True, also EC Parliamentary Assembly has as if a debate, parliamentary debate. But today, actually, Council of Europe's role in European foreign and security policy issues is totally different than it has been ever before. That's why our responsibility is so big when we are now addressing the questions. Lord Fox from United Kingdom just addressed this issue so that the fight in Ukraine is actually a common fight for all of us for democracy, and obviously the right for Europeanization for Ukraine is so crucial. True, we can also say so, but it's very interesting to analyze it in this way. Russians are frequently say that Europeanization or democratization, which obviously is a consequence of the Europeanization of Ukraine, is a threat against Russia. And actually, I can agree. It's not a threat against Russian people, but it is a threat against the oligarchic elite authoritarian structures of Putin's regime in Russia. Democratization of Ukraine, democratization of Belarus, it hasn't mentioned here, but those countries is obviously the next country to change is Russia itself. So actually, the struggle what Ukraine is now doing is also actually struggling for the democracy in Russia in long term. That is the important core to understand, that it is the collapse of Soviet Union, last battles going on, and obviously we are supporting Ukraine's national sovereignty in those terms. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sobolev, you're next on the list. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dear rapporteurs, I think that it's not a case that we decided to unite all these three reports. I think it's a good idea to analyze how autocratic regime became the fascist regime. And it's very important to analyze this in a comparison with fascist regime of Hitler. Putin started with the same problems that he started to solve. First of all, he decided to exclude, as Hitler did it many years ago, such nations as Austrians, Czech, Slovak, and other. So Putin started from Ukrainians, Georgians, Moldovan nation, in order to proclaim again and again his new ideas. Second, it's very important to analyze the mistakes of all mankind that all of our countries did many years ago, in order not to repeat these mistakes now. We are analyzing sanctions, but we must understand that Putin now, he is not only Hitler, he is as well Goebbels, because without propaganda it's impossible to do this dirty and bloody work that Putin is doing now. For example, here in Strasbourg, go to each hotel, switch on TV, and you will have possibility to watch minimum 4 Russian channels that are given blood, Russian world so-called, and Russian propaganda. is the same all around the world. About what sanctions we are saying now when more than 50 European companies, broadcasting companies, just previous week were prohibited in Russia. Second, we are discussing sanctions. But please, the last example, when one of 10 the most expensive jets, private jets, this year fly openly after sanctions from center of Europe to Russia. And it's a jet of Russian billionaire. What sanctions we are talking about? Or when we have sanctions against companies here in Europe and all over the world who try to increase oil and gas productivity. It's sanctions. No, it's nothing with the sanctions because it helps Russia to have bloody money for his invasion in Ukraine, in Georgia, and all over the world. So I think it's a very honest report. And thanks to amendments that we give to this report, we can have an excellent result here in this organization and then in our own parliaments in order to stop this fascist Putin's regime. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Mrs. Gazarian, the floor is yours.
Honorable Chair, dear colleagues, first and foremost, I would like to extend my gratitude to the reporters. I would like to thank Evgenia Kravchuk for her excellent work. We have discussed her report in our committee in various formats with different stakeholders. I would like to draw your attention to the very important discussion with the General Prosecutor of Ukraine. It was very important to have him in the discussion. The preservation of historical and cultural monuments is our collective responsibility, regardless of their cultural and national origin, because it is our collective responsibility to protect our shared human history. The destruction of cultural and historical monuments during wars have one very sharp goal. It is to destruct our cultural identity with the further intention to falsify history. In 2020, we witnessed the target destruction of St. Khazanchezo Church on two separate occasions. Dear Zhenya, you referred in your report to the destruction of cultural identity of Belarus, Ukraine and the South Caucasus. And I would like to clarify for all my colleagues one point that was mentioned in an explanatory note. When it comes to the mosques, I must emphasize that it is our responsibility to state to preserve them. And actually, one of the biggest mosques in Yerevan was restored back in 2000 with the help of Iranian government. Additionally, the mosques in the count that were mentioned in the explanatory, they were in a state of despair, I do agree, but there are two very important religious, religious monuments in Nakhon. One is a Christian chapel and another is a mosque. And they are in a state of despair, but they are registered in a state registry, and the state conducts annual photography documentation to protect and prevent further damage. In the new project of the cone, these monuments will be preserved. But I would like to draw your attention to the limitation of a cultural identity by the USSR, because back in 1930s, many essential churches in a city center of Yerevan were destructed by the decision of the Soviet authorities, like a church of Boros Petros in a city center. And according to the actual general logic of the report, this serves as an example of how USSR was trying to erase cultural history of its member states. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now the floor goes to Mr. Tistik. The floor is yours.
Honorable Chairman, dear colleagues, dear Eugenia. Having chosen all of these topics for the speech, I would like to draw special attention about countering the erasure of cultural identity in war and peace particular issue. The erasure of cultural identity during the war is a serious threat and an urgent problem for Ukraine. The process of Russification of Ukrainian cities, aggressive propaganda and imposition of Russian narratives endanger the identity of the Ukrainian people. This has been the direction of Russian state policy for centuries. Russia has always considered Ukrainian national culture figures to be enemies and has always destroyed them. Do you know about the Розстріляне відродження, which translates as short revival? Куліш, Франко, Коцюбинський, Тичина, Багряний. Ukrainian writers who even under conditions of silence and prohibitions created texts worthy of world appreciation. Then the Soviet authorities destroyed all of them, tortured or sent them to prison. After gaining independence, Russia didn't stop its efforts to erase Ukrainian culture. During the 1900s, Russian culture was actively promoted through various culture events, art projects, and educational programs. In particular, Russian music, cinemas, literature occupied a significant place in the Ukrainian market, which contributed to the formation of a positive image of Russia. Ukrainian culture in Russia was always presented as inferior. Pay attention to how Russia puts the establishments of Russians and the second official language in Ukrainian as one of the conditions for the end of the war. This is a tool to destroy Ukrainian statehood, and Russia understands the power of this tool. In the occupied Ukrainian terrorists, Russia immediately broadcast Russian channels, destroyed monuments of Ukrainian culture figures, returned or changed Soviet names to streets, prohibits the study of the Ukrainian language in the school, and rewrites Ukrainian history in textbooks. In our history, deported Ukrainian children are forced to speak only Russia and impose a Russian identity, raising them in the spirit of Russian patriotism and loyalty to their Russian government. This is a great challenge for Ukraine, but at the same time a chance for national revival and strengthening of cultural identity. Countering Russian aggression requires the mobilization of all resources, state, public, and international. The preservation and development of Ukrainian culture is a key element in this struggle. Preservation of cultural identity is a guarantee of stable and independent development of Ukraine in the future. And this is what of the Ukrainian people are fighting for. Thank you. Glory to Ukraine.
Thank you very much. Now the floor goes to Mr. Arato. The floor is yours.
The events of the past period fundamentally question the common order of Europe and the values that underpin it, which emerged after the horrors of the Second World War and the blood-paid victory of the Allies. It has been proven once again that oppression breeds war, and lasting peace can only be based on the full enforcement of human rights and freedom. It is precisely this realization that the European Council has stood for 75 years. Yes, the shadows of the 20th century have returned. The aim of the Russian attack on Ukraine is not only to steal territory and resources, not only to expand military threat to the whole Europe, but also to destroy entire Ukrainian identity and culture. Likewise, the disregard for international law and the cultural self-determination of the Armenian people in the case of the Nagorno-Karabakh and cases elsewhere in the world is troubling. From the idea of the superiority of nation, religion, and culture directly follows the inferiority of other cultures, nations, and peoples. We have seen this happen 8 decades ago, and we have seen the immeasurable suffering that has resulted for it all. Many people believe that these are only problems for certain countries and regions. I don't see it that way. If we accept of destruction of cultural values and national identity in the case of single country, a single region, we will not be protected either if our culture and our identity are endangered. That is why this organization must register and report all violations of human rights and all attacks on cultural identity without bias or exaggeration, but strictly adhering to the facts and our principles. Our tools are not a military power nature, but we have a voice and we must raise it if it's necessary. What we have rights to do at home, the protection of minority cultural and linguistic rights, and the right to identity belongs to every citizen and every community. Even in difficult times, it must be understood that granting minority rights, cultural and linguistic autonomy does not weaken. On the contrary, it threatens the common state of the majority and minorities. Yes, this is our job. This is what we can do. Act in defense of language, culture, identity of every community, every nation, at home, at European level, and in the international community. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The ballots for the election of judges to the European Court of Human Rights are now closed. And the next on the list is Mr. Levan Beshashvili. The floor is yours. Is it? No, it doesn't seem to be here, so the floor goes to Lukas Savickas. The floor is yours.
Dear President, dear colleagues, more than 2 years have passed since our mentioning of a full-scale invasion which began, and we continue to witness those devastating impacts of this war. And it is imperative that we establish a special tribunal for the crimes of aggression against Ukraine. This tribunal must be international in its scope, ensuring cross-regional support and minimizing any legal challenges. And therefore, I fully agree that the most feasible and the most effective way to do this is actually through an agreement between the Council of Europe and Ukraine. And the indiscriminate attacks on civilians, unlawful abductions, enforced disappearances, torture, deportation of Ukrainian children are but a few of the horrific acts that have been documented. And Russia's Federation must bear full international responsibility for these crimes, including those committed by Wagner Group as well. And the establishment of special tribunal and the compensation mechanism is our critical step towards justice. Sanctions have been a pivotal tool in our response. They serve as a non-military means to exert our pressure on those responsible for aggression, aiming to curb Russia's capacity to continue its war and to signal our unwavering support for Ukraine. The current sanction regime, which involves over 14,000 distinct measures, target key sectors of Russian economy, its financial assets, individuals complicit in the aggression. And the impact of these sanctions is already evident. Russia's economy has been significantly weakened, with substantial reduction in its financial reserves and its capacity, which is crippled, which was to sustain its military operations. And the loss of over $113 billion in oil revenue alone highlights the financial strain imposed by our measures. However, we must acknowledge that the sanctions is not foolproof, and gaps and loopholes have allowed the Russian authorities and their allies to circumvent some restrictions, necessitating a more robust and coordinated approach. And our path requires action to close these gaps. We must broaden the scope of personal sanctions to include those involved in human rights abuses, war crimes, and propaganda efforts. We must implement stricter export controls and penalties for companies and countries aiding Russian evasion tactics, and we must encourage more countries to join our sanctions regime and harmonize our enforcement efforts to eliminate those legal loopholes. And this requires a comprehensive approach, and all three reports do exactly that in the right direction. I congratulate the work of rapporteurs, and I urge to support the reports. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, next on the list is Mr. Markus Wichel. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. President. I first of all wish to thank the rapporteur, Mrs. Jasko, for her truly excellent and much-needed report on sanctions imposed on Russia over its invasion of Ukraine. It is indeed a very complete summary of what's been done so far by the international community, and it illustrates the wide range of forms that sanctions against Russia have in fact taken. As importantly, the report shows what remains to be done in terms of closing remaining gaps and loopholes. Loopholes that we detect as we go forward. A number of recent tragic developments make harder sanctions more and more likely and necessary. For example, there is a daily Russian carpet bombing of Ukrainian cities, with their horrifying toll in human lives and suffering, and the destruction of countless civilian homes and critical infrastructure. Such barbarian actions have the effect of further sharpening the position of all civilized countries as regards the need for even more far-reaching sanctions against Russia. This was also clearly shown at the International Summit on Peace in Ukraine, held the other day in the Swiss city of Birkenstock, whose final declaration was signed by 80 countries from all over the world. Thus, it seems more and more likely that additional Russian bank deposits will not only be internationally frozen, as up to now, but also that such Russian assets can be used by Ukraine to help its citizens rebuild their devastated homes, or to restore the country's destroyed energy and other vital infrastructure. It is heartening to note that not only the EU, but also international financial institutions such as the IMF and individual non-EU countries such as Switzerland are warming to this idea. It is not, of course, without a deep sense of sadness that the international community feels that it has to take recourse to drastic measures such as these. The civilized world vastly prefers a global order where relations between countries are peaceful and build on international law. This is also the underlying plea inspiring Mrs. Jasko's report. The ultimate purpose of sanctions is, after all, that they should no longer be needed. Mr. President, we stand by Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now the floor goes to Mrs. Lesia Vasilenko. The floor is yours.
I think now the microphone is on. These three reports are excellent in many ways, but more so is the excellent united discussion that we are holding today, as it gives us a comprehensive understanding of where the Russian aggression has come from and what are its consequences. I thank Davos Chair for a deep analysis of the legal and human rights aspects of the aggression. Evgenia Kravchuk for her 2-year work on how Russia weaponized culture, literature, education, and language to erase national identity. Lisa Jasko for underlining that sanctions do work, but also loopholes to these sanctions do exist. And this is exactly how Russia manages to continue its war, the very war that it unrolled. The rapporteurs are absolutely right in recommending that sanctions be enhanced, the lists of sanctioned individuals increased, and the oil cap compliance strengthened. Foreign companies and banks are to be encouraged to exit Russia. And I could not agree more with yet another reiterated call to seize and repurpose Russian frozen state assets. However, as a Ukrainian reading through these reports, I cannot but feel appalled. The consequences of the aggression keep growing by the hour, not even by the day. It will soon be 3 years since the escalation of an almost 11-year war happening right here before our eyes. The myriad of resolutions we pass in this assembly alone condemning Russia and prescribing actions amounts to several dozens by now. Each resolution is months of work from our colleagues, from the support staff, and from the experts. Essentially, each resolution we adapt at every session for the past 2 years is a guidebook for action, but always less action is taken than is prescribed. And this is where my appall is coming from. We know, we speak, we condemn, and yet more than 12,000 civilian deaths and the numbers are growing. Up to 8,000 prisoners of war and the numbers are growing. 20 Ukrainian cities razed to the ground and the numbers are growing. More than 3,000 cities and villages are under occupation. Evacuation has been carried out and is carried out at gunpoint with guns going off and killing the innocent, the never-ending air raid sirens by night and the attacks on the cities and towns and the stolen future. And also the stolen children of Ukraine, the erased past and the attempted genocide. Russia does it all and will continue to do so if we only continue to know, talk and condemn rather than act, 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 and then act again. I hope that these 3 reports and the recommendations therein will not only be adopted today, but will also give that critical, necessary push for concrete action. The rapporteurs have done their job. Now it's up to us to vote, and we will do so, and then up to our governments to do what is right and act firmly and unwaveringly, unanimously, for peace, for Ukraine, for humanity. Slava Ukraini!
Thank you very much. Thank you. Next on the list is Mr. Marek Borowski. The floor is yours.
1, 2, 3, okay. So we discussed today 3 very important and very interesting reports. I chose the report concerning the sanctions prepared by Elizaveta Jasko. This excellent report is a kind of manual from which we can learn almost everything about sanctions, about their impact on the course of the war, and what needs to be done to make them more effective. The sanctions are more effective when, inter alia, they are applied uniformly by all countries. Therefore, one should welcome the EU directive recently published containing the definition of the criminal offences for violation of sanctions, as well as indications concerning the penalties related to the different kind of offences. The EU member states have 12 months to incorporate this provision into their national legislation. From this place, I appeal to all colleagues to exert pressure on your governments to accelerate this process. The adoption of this directive is a good step to fight against the violation and circumvention of sanctions. The European Parliament proposed the next step. The idea is to expand the powers of the European Public Prosecutor's Office to prosecute not only financial crimes, but also the violation of sanctions. The adoption of this of such a solution could allow to operate throughout the European Union
on the basis of uniform standards. Dear colleagues, the sanctions are necessary. They weaken the Russian war machine, and they bring the end of the war closer. But the sanctions alone will not force Putin to stop the aggression. The decisive role in achieving the just peace will play the heroism of the Ukrainian army and unyielding attitude of the Ukrainian society. Therefore, we should aid and increase aid for Ukraine because Putin and his new gloomy buddy Kim Jong-un make up the threat not only to Ukraine, but to the entire free and democratic world.
Thank you very much. Now, next on the list is Mrs. Boniface. The floor is yours.
Honorable colleagues, the three reports under consideration in today's joint debate cover a wide range of vital overlapping issues related to Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. As much as I'd like to speak to all three, with my limited time today, I'll focus on some of the legal and human rights aspects raised by Rapporteur Stier. More specifically, I'll focus on the unlawful transfer or deportation of Ukrainian children. According to Ukraine's Children of War platform, at least 19,546 Ukrainian children have been deported or forcibly displaced since February 2022. Many of these children, most of whom have ended up in Russia, have been subjected to re-education programs and forced adoptions. Some have been sexually abused, and fewer than 400 have been returned. If you haven't had a chance to visit the Children of War platform's website, please do. The faces, the names, the dates of birth of these children personalize otherwise cold and anonymous statistics. And I'm pleased that Canadian funding supported this initiative. I should also mention that the Subcommittee on International Human Rights in the Canadian House of Commons heard from some of these children and their parents last year. Their testimony was heartbreaking and infuriating. I encourage you to read it. Canada welcomed the International Criminal Court's decision to issue arrest warrants for Vladimir Putin and his Commissioner for Children's Rights for, to quote our Foreign Affairs Minister, their alleged roles in the egregious scheme to deport Ukrainian children to Russia. I echo Rapporteur Stier's report in calling on all states to take note of the arrest warrants issued by the ICC and enforce them should any of the suspects come within their jurisdiction. The report, I note, also invites the ICC prosecutor to considering examining the reported allegations of genocide against Ukrainians, specifically regarding the transfer of children. As the forcible transfer of children constitutes an act of genocide under the Roman statute, that seems logical. In conclusion, I'd also like to highlight the ongoing work of the International Coalition for the Return of Ukrainian Children, which launched in Kyiv last February and which Canada is co-chairing with Ukraine. The coalition aims to improve information sharing, better align capacities, and improve our collective advocacy, all towards the ultimate objective of bringing Ukrainian children home to their families and to their communities and to Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now the floor goes to Mr. Alex Schaffer. The floor is yours. This one? Okay, so the floor goes to Mrs. Nieminen. The floor is yours. Sorry.
Mr. President, dear colleagues,
We are living in extraordinary times in Europe. Russia's attack on Ukraine has fundamentally and permanently altered our operating environment. As Ukraine fights for its very existence and for our joint values, there is no indication that the situation is changing. In Finland, as elsewhere, we have had to view this matter very seriously. Finland's recent foreign and security policy report considers that changed its situation and future concerns more strongly than before. The role of the state is to safeguard the country's independence and territorial integrity, as well as to protect citizens from various threats through national security and border control. We must secure before we can protect. Human rights are a central part of this. Finland's eastern border is over 1,300 kilometers long. It is also EU's and NATO's longest external border with Russia. Despite our preparedness, our national hostile resources are limited in the face of this long border. Due to Russia's hostile and unpredictable behavior, hybrid warfare, we must be even more prepared. As a result of instrumentalized immigration, Finland's eastern border has now been closed for over 6 months. Air traffic is restricted in the area and airspace has been violated. To prevent this extension in these extremely difficult circumstances, our Parliament is currently considering an implementation of the border law, which would ably, in particular, exceptional and compelling circumstances. This would always require knowledge of justified suspicion and influence from foreign states directed at Finland, causing a serious threat to Finland's sovereignty and national security when other means are no longer sufficient. We must be prepared for Russia's pressure on Finland to continue long-term and potentially take broader and more serious forms in the future. Ukraine knows this all too well. With Russia as our neighbor, you must prepare for all scenarios. Russia's attacks on Ukraine are very real and bloody, but hybrid means are also part of Russia's palette. Their aim is to destabilize our societies and, in the worst case, turn on ourselves. This could also risk turning away our attention from Ukraine. To avoid this, we need to find ways to tackle hybrid attacks, such as instrumentalized migration through EU-level cooperation.
Thank you very much. Now, Mr. Reinhold Lopatka, the floor is yours.
Dear Chair, dear colleagues, thank you for these 3 reports. And it is a wonderful coincidence that yesterday in Luxembourg, the talks between Ukraine and the European Union are started. And our new elected Secretary General of the Council of Europe has in his program as priority number 1, a free and sovereign Ukraine. And now we discuss these 3 reports. And I think it is important to continue with this discussion. Since the beginning of the Russian Federation's large-scale aggression against Ukraine, the Council of Europe, and in particular our Assembly, have set an ambitious agenda to support Ukraine and its people and to ensure justice and accountability for all violations of international law committed. And for me, this register of damage for Ukraine, which was established in 2023 at the Reykjavik summit, is very important. Although we know it will take time to deliver justice and reparation. But this register of damage brings a new quality. And some of us have said, by setting up a tribunal through an agreement with Ukraine, the Council of Europe would be acting only on behalf of its member states. It would be placing itself in the service of the international community as a whole in order to uphold the international legal order that was deliberately attacked by Russia. I think we have to continue to strongly condemn all the other international crimes committed in the context of the aggression, including war crimes and crimes against humanity. And we should clearly support the transfer of all Russian assets as a completely valid legal option under international law, as shown by many international law experts. This would be the best solution if we want to ensure compensation for all the damage caused to Ukraine as a consequence of the aggression, and if we want to avoid placing an unfair burden on the taxpayers of our country. And this register is an important step, and now we have it and we should use it. It is the biggest claim program in history that is based on international law. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now, next on the list is Mr. Bjarni Jonsson. The floor is yours.
I want to start by thanking all the rapporteurs for their valuable and important work. All three reports deserve further debate and attention, but given the limited time I have for this debate, I would like to focus on the excellent report of my dear colleague, Yevgenia Kravchuk, on countering the erasure of cultural identity in war and peace. Cultural cleansing is increasingly used by Russia as a weapon of war in Ukraine to deny the existence of a rich, distinct cultural identity and erase its historical roots, values, heritage, literature, traditions, and language. Moreover, the relationship between heritage and identity is crucial when considering these issues. The international recognition of cultural cleansing and erasure is of utmost importance. The deliberate and systematic destruction of cultural heritage and looting of cultural property, as well as human rights violations, are crimes against humanity. They are war crimes and should be prosecuted as such. Further, it is essential to determine the role that the policy of cultural erasure has as one of the inherent elements behind the intent to destroy a nation or any other group when committing genocide. We must address the critical legal challenges imposed by these systematic attacks, how we proceed in the most successful manner in documenting and prosecuting these war crimes, including exploration of effective investigative and prosecutorial strategies. Our task is vast, but it is not insurmountable. The first step was taken towards an international compensation mechanism for victims of Russian aggression at the Reykjavik summit, and we must ensure the success of that process. An important aspect of that is ensure that all those working in registering the damages, collecting evidence and testimonies of witnesses work in a standardized manner to ensure a strong case against the Russian regime. UNESCO has been working on monitoring the situation on the ground, regularly updating statistics on educational institutions and cultural sites damaged, and the monitoring and collection of evidence in Ukraine by the Register of Damages and UNESCO is of unquestionable urgency. But we must also think about ways of working in harmony, ensuring that all evidence is collected in a standardized way. And we must think of how we can ensure a wider jurisdiction for the register of damages and the tribunal that we must put in place. Could we think of ways to join forces with UNESCO and the UN to broaden the collaboration and use the standardized work of the registry to ensure an encompassing application of the damages collected by UNESCO and other bodies?
Thank you very much. Now the floor goes to Anna-Kristiina Mikkonen. The floor is yours.
Monsieur le Président, chers collègues.
President, dear colleagues, after the illegal occupation of Crimea by the Russian Federation in 2014 and the all-out invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the policy conducted by the Russian state has become systematic in terms of Russification of the occupied areas. Cultural cleansing is being used as a weapon of war in Ukraine to deny the existence of a different cultural identity and to erase the historical rights, values, identity, traditions, and language of the people. And it's important to condemn all the other international crimes perpetrated in the context of the occupation, including attempted genocide or public incitement to commit genocide, as well as many war crimes and crimes against humanity. The war of aggression waged by the Russian Federation against Ukraine needs to stop, and all those responsible should be held accountable for the crimes they've committed. A wide array of legal, political, and diplomatic measures are required in order to bring an end to the aggression. We need to adopt strong measures to strengthen the effectiveness of the sanctions regime. In other regions of Europe as well, Russia is endeavoring through its actions to sow disunity and uncertainty. Finland, my country of origin, shares a 1,300-kilometer border with Russia, but it's also the external border, eastern external border of NATO and the European Union, and is dealing with instrumentalized immigration since last year, with large-scale migration towards its western border by Russia. And the European legal system is not yet able to manage this instrumentalized immigration organized by another state. We need to examine European law and legislation and the way in which agreements function in terms of human rights. In this situation where a state uses immigrants in a vulnerable predicament as a tool for violating international agreements. The war calls into question international law as well as the Council of Europe in dealing with this challenge. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Now, next on the list is Mrs. Iñara Murnes. The floor is yours.
Thank all three rapporteurs for the work excellently done. All three reports aim at a long-term assistance to Ukraine, which is the right direction. But it's clear that what Ukraine needs today is victory, not just peace or just survival, because everything with just peace, just survival leads to new aggressions from Russia. Ukraine needs Western support, not until it is necessary, as there is still open question who will determine what is and what is not necessary, but till the complete victory of Ukraine and beyond. By complete victory of Ukraine, I mean regaining all territories currently occupied by Russia, including Crimea, as well as rebuilding of the country using Russian financial assets and contributions, establishing international tribunal to bring all war criminals accountable. Ukraine will need our full support and solidarity to carry out all necessary reforms and to heal all wounds of war, especially those inflicted to its people. Ukraine deserves prospects of becoming a fully fledged member of Western alliances, and I salute on starting Ukraine-EU accession talks and urge to do utmost to open doors of NATO for Ukraine. Even on its path to the EU and NATO, Ukraine makes these organizations stronger, more credible, and more realistic in their judgment and actions. The West should honor its promises, as Ukraine is constantly bleeding in its fight against Russian hordes. By this, Ukraine is protecting both the EU and NATO against Putin's aggression. Supporting Ukraine, we must see a very clear picture of Putin's Russia. During the Cold War, the Berlin Wall separated Western democracy from brutality of Soviet system. Today, we need new iron wall to safeguard democracy from constant hybrid attacks organized by Russia. Putin's regime has declared that Ukraine as a sovereign state and Ukrainians as a nation with its culture, language, and identity must cease to exist. I do believe that current Russia's regime, its ideology, and sheer brutality can be characterized by the term Russism. Likewise, Hitler's regime was Nazi regime. Today, we must contain and weaken Putin's regime by new sanctions. I hope 15th package of sanctions will be adopted soon. But to impose sanctions properly, Europe must overcome its greed. But the most important element in this picture is still military support to Ukraine, as NATO takes responsibility of military deliveries to Ukraine from Ramstein format. I hope it will broaden its boundaries by joining of South Korea, Japan, and others as more active and visible participants. Well, taking into consideration aspect of China possible outcome of forthcoming EU presidential elections, political landscape in the EU, we must speed up all activities, as democracy is under the threat, rules-based international order, and millions of Ukrainian lives are under the threat. Slava Ukraini!
Thank you very much. Next on the list, Mrs. Busic. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you. I think it works now. I would like to join our colleagues in congratulating the rapporteur for his detailed and thorough report containing crucial facts and information on the legal and human rights aspect of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. While addressing this very important and most crucial issue, we have to be very much aware of other threats that we are facing today. It is very clear that we are confronting new types of danger which should ring the alarm bells. If we don't take them seriously enough, new crises may catch us by surprise. It is obvious that there is ample evidence of Russia's meddling in other states' affairs without fearing consequences, as if they are confident that our strength and decisiveness will eventually wither away. It seems that they are not impressed with our expulsion and condemnation from our organization. And let us not have illusions. We must take them very seriously. We must make them pay for their consequences and for the damages that they inflicted on Ukraine, and make them responsible for their actions. We must show them strength and further isolation from Russia, from all the institutions that are relevant. As the rapporteur pointed out, it was in 2014 when Russia began its aggression against Ukraine. And in 2022, a full-scale invasion was launched. And from 2014 up to the invasion, Russia was a full member of the Council of Europe, although they were suspended from voting rights on multiple occasions. I dare to say that during that time, we took the situation too lightly, hoping that somehow conflict will be solved amicably and peacefully. After that, the full-scale invasion, Council of Europe was swift, very swift in reaction, and Russia was expelled from our organization with immediate effect. Furthermore, this report also points out various political developments which may cause uncertainty. In a way, it warns us that we can't afford to be complacent about our freedom and our security. We have the capacity to act firmly and decisively, and let us do that. Only that will act as a true deterrence to the Russian aggressors. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now the floor goes to Mr. Givi Mikanadze. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear colleagues, since Russia's illegal full-scale and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, the international community has put in place an unprecedented level of sanctions. Unfortunately, it is irrelevant to see that Ms. Yasko included Georgia together with several member states of the Council of Europe in an attached report of the resolution as a country through which Russia evades the sanctions. Although Georgia is not part of the implementation of sanctions, 3 high officials, sanctions envoys from the United States, European Union, and the United Kingdom visited Georgia to assess if there is any circumvention of the sanctions. I will quote Mr. David O'Sullivan, EU sanctions envoy, after the investigation he carried out in Georgia. He stated, and I am quoting, that the Georgian authorities are taking very seriously the issue of not allowing this country to be used as a platform for circumvention. And they have put in place significant measures of controlling the exports of possible export from Georgia of the most sensitive 38 products, and the same is true across financial sanctions, where they have put in place very close vigilance. And we are frankly impressed with the measures which they have taken. End of the quote. As a final assessment, the 3 high officials have left the country with a general very positive impression that the Georgian authorities are making sure that Georgia is not used as a platform for circumvention of sanctions. In addition, the Georgian Minister of Finance has informed society and partners that since imposing sanctions on Russia by Western countries, there has been no single case of violation. The ministry has established a special unit responsible for monitoring of movement of goods and persons on the territory of Georgia, controlled by the central government. The minister presented concrete figures proving Georgia's full commitment to preventing any attempt to circumvent sanctions. Particularly in 2 years since Russian aggression started in Ukraine, the Customs Service has recorded over 1,800 cases of when goods and transportation were denied to pass via Georgia, as well as in more than 1,000 cases there were Customs Service decisions on refusal to export or re-export goods, as all these cases were the attempt to circumvent the sanctions. In line with the above mentioned, all international partners and high-level officials who are directly in charge of monitoring the implementation of sanctions are recognizing positive cooperation by Georgian authorities to prevent any circumvention of sanctions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now the floor goes to Mrs. Yulia Ovchinnikova.
Yes.
The floor is yours.
Dear Mr. President, dear reporters, ladies and gentlemen, I want to start by sincerely thanking to the reporters for this really excellent work, Madame Kravchuk, Madame Yasko, Mr. Stier. Since the occupation of Crimea and parts of the Donbas region by the Russian Federation in 2014, followed the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Russia has been systematically committed terrible crimes on the territory of Ukraine, causing the biggest humanitarian catastrophe since the Second World War. The PACE and the Council of Europe have clearly defined key political and legal actions to put Russia Federation to international criminal responsibility as the world criminal for this global humanitarian crisis and genocide. International Special Tribunal, Register of Damages, damage compensation mechanism, transfer of seized frozen Russian state assets to International Compensation Fund for Ukraine, and envision the leading role of the Council of Europe. These are key principles for the justice and peace we have agreed together. Today's resolution reaffirms that. Achieving a just and lasting peace for Ukraine depends on this accountability, as a peace must be founded on justice and international cooperation. The first peace summit of Ukraine in Switzerland in June 2024 noted that any peace process should adhere to the principle of a just and lasting peace as outlined in President Zelensky's peace formula. We ask to all member states to assist the Ukrainian authorities in our efforts to investigate such crimes by providing resources and expertise. Altogether, in European and global solidarity, we have to make Russian Federation fully compensation for the damage caused to Ukraine, our citizens, our land, our culture, our environment. So international mechanism for reparation and international register of damages is highly needed. No one has right to wage a war aggression against a neighbor and undermine one of the basic principles of the United Nations Charter, the territorial integrity of states. No one has the right to threaten the world with nuclear weapons. No one has the right to undermine food, energy, of any other security of the world and its region. No one has the right to kidnap the children of another nation. No one has the right to undermine global peace. So let's pull out the weeds of terrorism together and let the rule of law and democracy bloom. Thank you very much, and Slava Ukraini!
Thank you very much. Now the floor goes to Mr. Don Tuik. The floor is yours.
Colleagues, Vladimir Putin's act of aggression against Ukraine has not been witnessed in Europe since the early part of the last century. The invasion of Ukraine followed the most duplicitous act when Putin declared he had no intention of attacking that country, almost to the time his troops crossed the border. The free and democratic nations of Europe must stand with the Ukrainian people against this aggression, this tyranny. A tyranny which has taken a free, liberated, newly democratic and progressive Russia, the Russia of Mikhail Gorbachev, taken it back to the dark days of Soviet times under Stalin. The awful suffering of the people of Ukraine is shown nightly on our television screens. Ruthless aggression, which has seen the rape of women, the abduction of children, and the slaughter of young and old alike, is a warning to all the freedom-loving people of Europe. The message is clear: resist this evil or we face the same. Yes, we must arm and support Ukraine in defense of its people and homeland. But I believe the battle is not so much with the Russian people. Our battle is with the corrupt, evil criminals who've gained control of Russia. The matters before us today are part of our defiance of that tyranny. The reports before us are weapons in our battle against an evil, corrupt gangsters who now run Russia as if they own it. We should not only freeze the gangsters' assets, we should seize their assets, their ill-gained wealth. Hit them where it hurts most. Take away the tyrants' wealth, and we take away their power. The reports show the free and democratic countries of Europe how we can help rebuild Ukraine and deter aggression in future. Let the people of Ukraine know, and also let the freedom-loving people of Russia know, that we in this Council of Europe stand for liberty, freedom and justice for all peoples and all nations. United in our purpose, we will secure liberty, freedom and justice and defeat tyranny in Europe. The proposals in the report show us the way forward. Let us, colleagues, embrace those proposals. Let us adopt them. More, let us act upon them.
Thank you very much. And now, before passing the floor, I want, if you don't mind, I take the chance to say goodbye to the Assembly. After 8 years, this is my last day, and I want to sincerely thank everyone. Thank you very much. And now, thank you very much. And now, thank you very much. Now the floor goes to Mr. Luzlin Basha. The floor is yours. No, it's not here. Yeah. No, it's not here. So the floor goes to Mr. Joseph O'Reilly. That is not here. No. Is it? Okay. Okay. The floor is yours.
The atrocities that go with it in terms of loss of life, of grievous injuries, the abduction of the children, the destruction of infrastructure, the destruction of cultural heritage are combined to be the greatest contemporary crime internationally. A huge international crime, a huge wrong. And we support, without reservation, without question, the independence, the sovereignty, and the territorial integrity of Ukraine. And we condemn the atrocities and the violations of human rights. So the question arises, what specifically can be done? And the first thing to look at is the area of sanctions. It is clear that while the sanctions are impacting, and I gather are impacting more laterally than before, that they are not sufficiently comprehensive and that they are not sufficiently policed. It's my understanding, I don't have the detail, that the EU this week have turned their attention to dealing with this secondary exportation of liquefied island gas, or liquefied gas rather, to third countries, and thus breaking the price control and the export controls. So I think that we need to move there. I think we need to widen the sanctions, but very particularly we need to police the sanctions, and we need to see that they work in every country. Parallel with a very strong sanctions, and it behoves each of us to come here to this assembly and be fit to say that we're doing enough in our own countries. Parallel with that, we do need, as the first report of my colleague Devore points out, we do need an international tribunal. The international tribunal should be set up with haste and with competence and with consultation, and that should be going on apace, and we need quick results on that, unquestionably. We also need to deal with the question of the abduction of 20,000 children, which is a horror, and that's the ones we know about. And to think that a number of those from institutions are being used as part of the war machine to be slaughtered on the front fighting against their own people and their own heritage is a horror beyond measure. So let's attack this by going after the issue of the children. Let's beef up the sanctions and let's work on them. Let's get the tribunal into place. And we will be judged by our results, not by our words. Thank you very much, President.
So, dear colleagues, now we have to suspend the list of speakers and we will continue this afternoon at 4:30. Before I announce you the names of the newly elected, because as far as I know that we have no need of a second round, we have elected judges. I want to thank our dear colleague Marco Nicolini, who was chairing this morning. Dear Marco, it was a pleasure having you with us for almost 8 years. And it was a very fruitful period, a period which was very interesting as well. Thank you for your excellent job, either as a member of different committees or as a vice chair of this assembly. I know that somewhere up there is your wife and maybe your daughter. And I want them to know that they should be proud of you, as we are, because we have met a man of ethics, a politician of ethics, and one who served rule of law, democracy, and human rights the best way here in our assembly. I wish you all the best for the future. Dear colleagues, I now have the honor to announce the results, elections of a judge to the European Court of Human Rights for Austria. Total number of members voting, 153. Number of spoiled or blank ballot paper, 0. Number of valid votes, 77. Absolute majority, number of valid votes, 153. Absolute majority of the votes cast, 77. And we have, the votes were cast as follows. 92, Mr. Andras Jacob. 31, Mrs. Ursula Kriebaum. 30, Mrs. Brigitte Oms. Mr. Jacob, having obtained an absolute majority of votes cast, is elected judge of the European Court of Human Rights for a term of office of 9 years, which shall commence on 1st November 2024. Elections of a judge to the European Court of Human Rights for Finland. Total number of members voting, 154. Number of spoiled or blank ballots, 0. Absolute majority of the votes cast, 78. The votes were cast as follows. 40, Mr. Pekka Aalto. 25, Mrs. Satu Heikkilä. 89, Mr. Juha Lavapuro. Mr. Lavapuro, having obtained an absolute majority of votes cast, is elected judge of the European Court of Human Rights for a term of office of 9 years, which shall commence on 1st January 2025. We congratulate him. Election of a judge to the European Court of Human Rights for Serbia. Total number of members voting, 155. Number of spoiled or blank ballot paper, 0. Absolute majority of the vote cast, 78. The votes were cast as follows. 105, Mr. Mateja Durovic. 38, Mr. Vladimir Marinkov. 12, Mrs. Natasha Plavsis. Mr. Durovic, having obtained an absolute majority of votes cast, is elected judge of the European Court of Human Rights for a term of office of 9 years, which shall commence not later than 3 months after his election. We congratulate him. So as I said, the debate will continue this afternoon at 4:30, when we will hear the replies to the debates and consider the amendments tabled. I would like to ask you all to be here, not only for the debate, of course, which is our priority, but for receiving the Olympic flame, which for the first time in the 75 years of our Assembly, of our Council of Europe, will enter the hemicycle. And it is an honor for us to receive the flame of peace, the flame of human rights, the flame of democracy. We'll see you all here in a few hours. Thank you. Sitting is adjourned.